Welcome back to #Lloyd, everyone. Today's chilling subject, an 11-year-old boy died allegedly of hypothermia because of the lack of power to his mother's home. Is this lawsuit going to win in court? Dig in and let's get our thoughts. Welcome back to #Lloyd, everyone. You have Austin and myself, your favorite legal aid team, here in studio.
It's good to be back after the power outages and everything like that.
Oh my gosh.
It actually, when we walked in today, I almost said it feels like it's been a very long time since we've sat in here.
It does. It feels like it has been a long time.
Yeah. It's good to be back and with power.
With power.
We got lights and everything.
Oh my gosh, I know. We lost power for 2 days, almost completely, lack of power for 48 hours. But thankfully, we never lost water. I think it's because our builders accidentally, because we have a smaller home in our development, accidentally built our hot water heater into the insulation of our house. So that never busted, which meant that our water system never busted and had to be capped and whatever.
Yeah. So, well, I got water back 4 days ago. So
4 days ago?
4 days ago.
That's miserable.
On Tuesday night. So, I mean,
shoot.
The thing is, in the big picture, especially with the story we're talking about today, all these little inconveniences, kind of not a big deal. I feel very lucky.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, when our producer sent this story out, I hadn't heard about it. So I didn't realize.
No, I hadn't heard about it either.
How crazy this is about what happened to this family. And
it's wild.
It's wild. It's wild. And it gives us a great opportunity to explore some of the legal background behind it and kind of talk about the ins and outs of really what this entity is and sovereign immunity, all those types of things. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a really good example of, I don't want to use the term catastrophic injury, right? Because we normally use that for airplane accidents and such. But I think this is a good example of what an extreme personal injury case can look like.
Right.
So for our listeners, who have been following along with us, in a prior episode, we had Paul Wingo on discussing personal injury law. So I think this is a case that exemplifies how wild the world of personal injury can get.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Gosh, okay, well, let's dig into the fact pattern here. So obviously everyone knows about the Arctic storms that swept through Texas, February 11th through 18th, literally Arctic weather. That blew my mind.
It was surreal.
It was
the entire
insane.
experience was surreal.
I mean, at first it was all fun and games, right? Because I was like, oh, it's snowing, yay!
Right.
And so I took Stella, my puppy, outside, and she loved the snow. She loved the ice more. She likes to eat ice. So she's over there, on the ice.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, girl, you gotta stop chewing the ice.
Right.
This is not good for you. At least that quantity of ice. But then quickly after that, it was like, this is not cute anymore.
Right. This was fun. It was great for pictures. And then now, okay, we're over it.
I know. So maybe if Matt thinks it's cute, we'll pop in a video of Stella in the snow.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the cuteness aside, because we said the cuteness lasted 5 minutes, there was a bunch of literal awful things that happened because of the weather.
Absolutely.
Out in Fort Worth, there was that 130 car pileup.
Which was nuts.
Insane. There was a pileup somewhere in Austin. And just all sorts of awful things. And I think probably the worst story I heard, and Matt's the one who brought the story to our attention, is that this little 11-year-old boy, and I'm Cristian Pavonz, and I'm probably, if I mispronounce his name, I'm so sorry. But this little kid died in his bed in his mother's home under a pile of blankets, allegedly of hypothermia.
Right. And the autopsy hasn't come back yet. We don't know that.
Which is why we're saying allegedly.
Allegedly, right. But, according to some of and we'll get into the lawsuit in a second, but according to the lawsuit and some of the news reports that have come out, he was with, I believe, his 3-year-old brother or another child living in the home. Pavon had immigrated to this country and they were in a trailer home, mobile home, and they were without power and it was down in Conroe, Houston area. And temperatures got down to kind of like they did in Dallas, down to around 10 degrees, 12 degrees. And, mother, he was non-responsive. Mother calls 911, tries to give him CPR and unfortunately passed away.
Gosh. That's no one wants anything bad to happen to a child, but how awful and tragic, he was under a pile of blankets. His mom was doing literally everything she could, it sounds like, to try and keep him warm. And it just wasn't enough.
Yeah. Well, and when we get to the lawsuit, there's some interesting factors that play into that, because I'll be honest, I was talking to someone yesterday about this, and the first question was, well, why wasn't there something done? Why didn't the mom do something? And there's some things that are alleged in the lawsuit that make sense to me factually as to why that situation happened. But we'll get into that when we start talking about it.
Yeah, we'll need to bring that up. But I think the first thing that we need to back up and kind of discuss is what the heck is ERCOT?
Right.
And I'm sure I pronounce it differently than other people. So, because everyone's, at first, in my neighborhood, right, so Encore provides the electricity to my neighborhood.
Right.
At first, everyone's
Same
like,
here.
okay, so there you go. They're all like, oh my gosh, Encore, like, what the frick? Like, rolling blackouts again? Like, what are you doing? We're so mad at you. And then after a little digging, you're like, oh, wait, it's not Encore who
something
decides.
bigger than what Encore, is, basically.
Yeah. Have you ever seen Stranger Things?
No, I haven't.
Oh.
Netflix series?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know why we're friends. I'm kidding. So
be a little truth serum here when we first get back to the studio. All right, cool.
Just a little. This is what happens when I only have like a cup of coffee. Anyway, so there's in Stranger Things at one point there's this like giant spidery thingy that's like.
This is why I haven't seen it. I have a phobia of spiders. So
you do?
Yeah.
Really?
So we're learning stuff on air.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So okay.
So does my sister. I kill spiders for her, even though I don't like them. But whatever. All right, I'll save you from a spider.
Appreciate
Austin.
that. Thank you.
Yeah. So anyway, there's this giant like spider thingy that's like menacingly looking over the town, and it's not tentacles, but legs thingies.
Yeah.
It's like, aha, I'm going to get you, and I can control you, and it's a reference to the Upside Down. Anyway, the whole point is that to me, that image is like, oh no, something big bad is controlling and manipulating things in this town. That's kind of how I view ERCOT.
So the spider is ERCOT. Okay.
Yeah, the spider is ERCOT.
ERCOT is the spider. Maybe that's a better way to put it.
I know, right? This analogy is getting a little drawn out, but so ERCOT is short for the Electricity Reliability Council of Texas, which Governor Abbott has come out and publicly said that they are not reliable.
I think, this story tells that.
This story shows that ERCOT is not reliable. So ERCOT basically controls the ebb and flow of electricity to 85% of Texas consumers.
Okay. And I didn't know any of this going into this either. It's interesting to me looking at some of the stuff that we researched pre-show. It's a membership-based type of entity. So I guess that means that do providers decide to become members, or is it counties, or how does that work? Do you know?
It's a really high level. I try to keep it high level because it gets real detailed. But so ERCOT is what's known as an independent system operator, and there's only like a handful, like 5, 7, something like that in all of North America. Mm-hmm. And so what ERCOT does is that it's not a power generator. It basically facilitates the provision of power from power plants, whether it be a coal, a nuclear, a natural gas, wind power, whatever. And then it facilitates the distribution to the different customers, whether it be, the customers that are actually doing distribution like Encore, who's actually doing distribution to places like our neighborhoods, or whether it's, other entities. So it's very confusing, but basically Encore or ERCOT is kind of like an auctioneer.
Okay.
And so it's this like purely capitalistic market-based system about determining electricity prices from various different sources of energy. And then they do the auctioneering on who gets what electricity at what price per kilowatt hour.
Okay. And to the different, like you said, to the different customers, or even like a provider like Encore. Okay.
Yeah, that's my very like high level of general understanding, because I could do like a full probably 2 episodes into how ERCOT works. Yeah.
That's a little too boring for what we like to put on the show.
But anyway, the thing about ERCOT is that it's just like a total faith in capitalism and that the market knows best. And normally that works great. It didn't work great here.
Right.
Because there wasn't a centralized planning authority to make sure that the different pipes were winterized. And we'll get into that in just a second, because what I want to really highlight, and I think this is very interesting, ERCOT is a nonprofit. It's a 501c3 nonprofit organization. It's not a government entity.
And that's when I saw that throws me off too, because the whole idea, like you were just saying, is that it's relying on the capitalist market to drive it, which 501c3 capitalism kind of, in most people's minds, mine included, it's kind of the opposite, right?
Right. And so it's this private organization, but then it's under the jurisdiction or under the purview of the Texas Legislature and the Public Utility Commission of Texas, or the PUC.
Okay. So it's kind of a quasi-private, quasi-public.
So technically, It kind of reminds me a little bit of the Federal Reserve
Okay.
because a lot of people think that the Federal
analogy.
Reserve is a public arm of the government. It's not. It's a private entity.
Right.
But it affects the public with everything it does. It is been given a power by Congress. And so even though it's a private organization, it's almost more like quasi-public-private.
Yeah.
Which is kind of wild when you think about it.
It is.
Makes me nervous.
Well, yeah, a little bit, because there's a lot of things that can go sideways with that.
Yeah.
Because you get into gray areas where
you do.
We've got public oversight for governmental entities, whether it's regulatory agencies, other parts of the executive branch. But then when you've got a private industry or private entity, I mean, capitalism is supposed to vet that out, and Darwinism takes control typically. So yeah, that is interesting. And one thing I also learned about ERCOT is there's no federal oversight. This is purely a state thing at different in different states, like you mentioned. And so if there's any kind of oversight, like what we're talking about with the Texas Public Utility Commission or Public Utility Commission of Texas, it's a state-based relationship.
Which is interesting. So, and like, let's back that up. Earlier, I was talking about how there are independent service operators in North America. There's only like a handful of them. So I'm sure people have been hearing a lot about the grid and how the Texas grid was overloaded. And that's why we had all these blackouts, right? Because the grid just couldn't handle it, couldn't function. Okay, what the frick is the grid? Yeah,
that's a term everybody likes to throw around too.
Okay, so like, why don't you explain the grid really fast and like a high level thing, and then I'll explain like how it's not connected with everything else.
Well, and I'll tell you the best way that I can understand the grid, and I'm going to look at my notes here because it's not something I really understood before this, but it's literally a grid made of steel and copper. It conducts the electricity through to everywhere it goes. Hospitals, buildings, homes, every place.
Consumers.
So it's an actual physical grid. And so I guess when someone's saying they're going off the grid, they're literally getting off the copper wire.
Yeah, they're getting off the wire. I know. It's like I have this family member, and he mentioned to me, he's like, well, I would like to live completely off the grid with solar panels. And he was inquiring about the price. And I was like, well, you're going to need a lot of solar panels. And Tesla batteries are pretty expensive, like the Powerwall. Because I looked into it since I was like, I don't want to lose power again. And I've got solar panels. And I was like, that's pretty pricey.
Yeah.
So living off the grid is doable, but it comes with a hefty price tag. And the reason that people keep talking about the Texas grid, right, and how the Texas grid failed is that Texas is unique in the fact that we have our own grid. We're not hooked into a grid that spans the rest of the nation. So most other states have grids that are interconnected to one another. Texas does not have that. And there's a long, long history that has to do with why we have our own grid and how even ERCOT came to be because we have our own grid, and it deals with like aluminum smelting companies. It's a lot. You could write a whole freaking paper on this. So if you're in school and you want to write a paper on this would be interesting, I think. But anyway, we're not going to go into like the aluminum history here, but we're going to take this back to ERCOT, how the grid failed, and basically why the grid failed. I know some people are saying that because Texas's energy output is about 10% renewable, because we're actually, I think in like, I don't know, 2017 maybe? I don't know. And within the last 5 or so years, we actually outperformed California in terms of utilizing percentage of our power that was from wind-based power. So more like a higher percentage of our total like electricity that's generated comes from wind power. And that's more than California, which I was like, that's interesting because Texas is like the fossil fuel capital of the country. Yeah,
well, I mean, if you went to school in West Texas like I did, you see a lot of the windmills we have out there. It maybe doesn't surprise me as much because I've seen, the more I drive out to Lubbock, the more you see tons and tons of more windmills going up. So I can see that.
Yeah. Okay, so it makes sense. First-hand account. So that's interesting. So some people are saying, oh, the wind turbines froze and that's what caused the blackout. Well, no. So it froze because with like literally the Arctic vortex that like slammed into Texas, we had, I think it was like about 28,000 kilowatt hours, 28,000 megawatts, excuse me. Numbers are not my thing, of like coal and nuclear and gas power that just went completely offline.
Right.
They just weren't working.
Right.
So it was the whole mix of energy that just was starting to fail.
And that comes from and this is a general term, but it comes from the idea that Texas didn't properly winterize its systems. And if anybody's ever owned a boat or, honestly, even, car, there's some certain winterizing things you need to do when cold weather happens. And it sounds like we didn't do that.
Yeah. So like one example, right, that they failed to winterize the pipes that were conduits for the natural gas.
Right.
And so natural gas is one of the primary energy providers here in Texas. It burns cleaner than coal. So it's one of the things that we're like, oh, it's a fossil fuel, but it's a cleaner fossil fuel. Let's use this. So the thing is that they didn't winterize the pipes, which meant that the pipes froze over, lost pressure, and then depressurized, which meant that it couldn't conduct the natural gas. So it just couldn't go to the plant to create electricity.
And then we had what I never thought we would hear about in Texas. You hear about in California all the time is rolling blackouts.
Yeah, y'all. So I'm originally from Southern California. I don't know how many of y'all knew that, but I am. And so I grew up with rolling blackouts all the time. They suck.
Well, we experienced that. We saw
but no, let me tell you, losing power for 48 hours, that is not a rolling blackout. That is a blackout.
It's a blackout, right.
Okay, rolling blackouts, the ones that I grew up with, it's like you didn't have power for 45 minutes to an hour and a half, and then the power came back on, and then the next neighborhood over on the next section of the grid lost power for 45 minutes to an hour and a half, and it cycled.
Right.
Okay, it didn't cycle with millions of people in Texas. You just lost power.
Right.
And I think part of that was because there are some entities or there are some places like hospitals that people are literally on like life support machines. And so they need constant power. And they were just, some people who live on portions of the grid just didn't get that because the electricity was needed to support things like hospitals.
Sure.
And then people who were lucky enough to live on the part of the grid that feeds into hospitals,
they were fine.
They were fine.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, all of that to say, we have this quasi-public-private entity that is an auctioneer for overseeing who gets electricity at what price in Texas, and they failed to winterize the pipes, and we had blackouts that weren't really rolling because they were just blacked out, and we all suffered Arctic temperatures, and it was awful, but it was really awful for this family in Conroe, Texas.
And that really sets up, that's why ERCOT's one of the main parties that's being sued here is because they're saying that you didn't do your job as the auctioneer. Well, first off, there's a lot of things they're saying.
There's a lot of things.
But that's one of the lead storylines is you had a job to do. You were supposed to be the one that auctioned out this power to send it out there to make sure that we weren't going to have these problems, and you didn't do it.
Yeah, and I thought it was really interesting that one of the things the attorney was saying, and I guess I'll say this and then we'll kind of back up a little bit, is that ERCOT knew before the storm hit that it was going to have to institute rolling blackouts.
Yep.
Okay, well, like we said earlier, to someone like me who has grown up rolling blackouts, 45 minutes to an hour and a half, not days and days and days at a time. So it sounds almost like to me like a failure to warn. And it almost sounds like the attorney is saying, ERCOT, if you had told us in advance, you had done a better job of telling your customers that these aren't just rolling blackouts. Like they're going to be without power for like 2-4 whatever days at a time. And you need to prepare because it's going to be extremely cold. Like you could die from cold. Give yourself time to prepare. Then maybe this tragedy of this little boy dying wouldn't have happened.
And that's exactly what kind of we were commenting about earlier is that there were one at the beginning of it, there was exactly those comments of it's not going to be that long. It's going to be fine. I think one of the exact quotes in the lawsuit was the only warnings that were put out there was for everybody to unplug their new fancy appliances that they bought during quarantine and just so that we can make sure we're conserving energy. And then even during the process, whenever the storm hit and the power went out, there were further messages put out that, hey, this is not going to be that long. These are just rolling blackouts. And so that to me is kind of the big factor going back to why didn't the mother do something? Yeah. She was being told that, hey, this isn't going to be that long. This isn't going to be that long. And look, I don't know anything about their financial situation, their family situation, whatever. She may not have had other places to go or may have had to get real creative and but thought, okay, well, look, we're here. We're in our home. This is only going to last for a short period of time. And so I think that's one of the big things that's going to kind of guide this lawsuit is it wasn't just that you messed up on the front end and it was that you made those, statements. You didn't give proper warning, even though you're the one that really is tasked with knowing this.
They're the expert.
Exactly. You know more than the consumers. You have a duty as...
They are literally controlling the blackouts.
Right. And then when it started happening, instead of being forthcoming and saying, you know what, this was a lot worse than we thought, people need to take shelter, or whatever phrase you want to use, they further perpetuated the problem by saying, no, it's fine, until it wasn't.
Yeah, until it was irreversible damage was done.
Right, absolutely. And then, of course, the other part of this is on the front end, there are claims that there were warning signs that they should have known, ERCOT should have known they needed to winterize the grid. They needed to take some of these preventative measures on top of the fact that they gave, as we've seen now, improper warnings about what was going to happen.
Yeah, because Texas has had, I think, 30 years ago and then maybe around 60 years ago, I think this has happened once or twice before, where we've had similar Arctic-esque weather that's come in and slammed into Texas before. So there have been warnings, and ERCOT just has failed to winterize the pipes because it happens so infrequently that, okay, well, you spend all this money to winterize and you only need it every, 30 years?
Yeah, and we haven't seen something this intense.
I've never seen it. I mean, I'm only 30, so.
Right. But in the lawsuit, in some of the stories, they've talked about, okay, in 2011, back when we had the Super Bowl here in Dallas, there was some big winter issues there. And they said, okay, well, from those signs, we thought we were fine. And then they referenced a time in 2018 when temperatures got real cold. And this is an extreme situation. Understand that. Probably, and we won't get into this too much, but one of their defenses is probably going to be that this was an unforeseeable intervening cause that, they couldn't have foreseen that it was going to be this intense.
Which, for those of you who don't know, that's called an affirmative defense. And when someone is sued and they put out in Texas state court their answer, they also will give a list of what are called affirmative defenses, saying like, hey, well, yes, what you're saying happened, but wait, it's not my fault because.
Yeah. And so that's, I think they're going to use those. They're going to use that as an affirmative defense. Obviously, the plaintiff's side representing the boy, the deceased boy and his family are going to say, well, okay, yeah, but these were also warning signs. So this is more intense than you ever expected, but you had warning signs and you had one job to do.
Yeah, it's foreseeable.
Absolutely, I think it is. I think it is. I think that's going to be a losing affirmative defense. I don't think they're going to be able to make that work.
I would agree. And so, the reason, that we care about foreseeability is that that's an element in a negligence claim.
Right.
And so just to kind of give the audience an overview, the big claims in this lawsuit is that the mother is suing for negligence and gross negligence, correct, against ERCOT and also her energy provider, which is Entergy, Texas, I believe.
I think that's right.
I
know it's right. Yes.
Yeah, I had not heard of them before reading about this, but...
Makes sense, and they're in a different part of the state than we are.
Sure. Yeah, we're in North Dallas, they're in North Texas, and they're in South Texas. Yeah. So, I mean, were there any other claims, or was it just those two?
Those are the ones I saw.
Okay.
And candidly, I didn't look real deep into the actual, pleadings that were filed, but and that makes sense. They're saying that you go back to Paul Wingo, what he talked about on our show. It's their job to auction off the energy. It's they're in a position to understand how this works and to make sure, because they're the only ones that have the ability the foreseeability to see, okay, if this happens, how do we fix it? How do we handle it? And so it's their responsibility to take care of that. They didn't do it. That's a mistake. It's negligence. And so then that falls
allegedly
square.
Negligence.
It's if they didn't do it, if it's proven that they didn't do it, then that's what the plaintiff is going to try to show here.
So, but let's kind of explain negligence for maybe those people who don't understand it. So, we hear the term negligence thrown around all the time, right? Oh, you were negligent and blah, blah, blah. So negligence is actually, a really specific set of causes of action.
Right.
So do you want to just give the quick elements really fast, and then so people can understand the elements and then why we're so harping on the foreseeability. Right.
And I would definitely encourage people to go back and watch our episode with Paul Wingo. He walks through some of that too. But the idea is that, and I'm going to paraphrase this, is that there is a duty that is owed by one person, individual, entity, something like that, to another person, individual, entity, whatever. And someone breaches that duty. So let's just couch in terms of this. ERCOT owes a duty to auction off the electricity to the right providers to make sure that, and the argument's going to be to make sure that we don't have rolling blackouts, to make sure the pipes are winterized and adequately able to handle this winter storm. And then they didn't do that. They breached that duty. And then that duty, or that breach of duty, caused the damages that occurred.
The little boy dying.
And the foreseeability element factors into a couple pieces of it. Usually you talk about it in the proximate cause side, a little bit in the duty and breach side. But the idea is that this type of injury that occurred doesn't even have to be this specific one, but this type of injury that did occur in the events that transpired to lead to it was something they reasonably could have predicted. They should have known that it could happen. And then at that point, it's like, okay, well, you have that duty to correct, prevent, proactively address that problem. And if you don't, okay, then that's where we get to you were negligent.
And I think what I want to really talk about here is the duty element, because what I think is going to be interesting on two different levels is kind of categorizing and determining and finding precedent for what that duty is, and then the sovereign immunity, which we'll discuss in a little bit. So, like I said earlier, ERCOT is one of like a handful of independent system operators. There's only one in Texas. So with negligence claims, there's, yes, like we said, duty is the first element. You have to show that there's a duty. They would have to show that ERCOT had a duty to the little boy to basically do its job correctly.
Right.
So, but oftentimes, that duty is going to be like in case law, it's pretty clear. Like, for example, a accountant has a duty to do his accounting job correctly. And it's a little different because he's a professional, he's providing a professional service. But basically the standard is going to be that, I think the standard is going to be, did ERCOT act as a reasonable independent system operator would in the same or similar circumstances? And because there's only one ERCOT in Texas, one independent system operator, I think it's going to be interesting. I think they're going to have to look outside of Texas to say, well, how did the other independent system operators in other parts of the country act? Yeah. Which is kind of dicey because it's a state court claim and we don't normally look outside of Texas state courts. Right. Usually I tell my friends, like, if I have to look outside of Texas for case law to support my opinion, I'm probably doing something wrong because it's not a controlling opinion. Right. Right. Which means that state courts in Texas, the judges there don't have to listen to what a California judge says about the same type of case because the way that our system is set up is that the state courts have to look at what their state courts have done in previous situations like this, apply that law. Yeah. And if there are changes, they can make changes slowly there. But that's the reason that it's not that it doesn't matter what other states have done, but it's not mandatory and binding on the Texas state judges. And that's any state. Yeah, and that's it's not as persuasive. Right. So for example, because California has really different policies than Texas. Right. Vermont has really different policies than Texas. So what Vermont and California do, the courts can say, hey, that's great. You guys do you. We have our own policies, and the people who live in Texas have different values, different preferences than those in Vermont and California. And so we're going to operate based on the case law that's been built around what Texas or Texans care about. Right. So I think the duty aspect will be interesting. I think that the foreseeability is there's pretty good argument there. I think so too. But I think the duty will be in the interesting part. Yeah, it'll be interesting. And of course, like any other lawsuit, this could settle before that ever gets tested. It probably will, I feel. Yeah, I think without law nerding out too much, I bet we'll see it go to summary judgment stage because the insurance companies typically are going to want to see, can the plaintiff survive summary judgment or not? What's summary judgment? So summary judgment is a method or a tool, I guess would be the better way to put it, that lawyers can use in the context of or in the storyline or life cycle of a lawsuit. Pre-trial. Like so instead of before trial. You file a lawsuit, eventually you're going to end up in trial at some point if the case doesn't settle. If the parties don't say, okay, you pay me this and I'll go home. A way to not go to trial is you file a motion for summary judgment that says, going back to what we were just talking about with case law, the law in the state of Texas says this, our case fits squarely into these facts of these previous cases that were decided by courts. So because of that, we don't need a jury or a judge to make an ultimate determination here about the facts of this case and go through all the different aspects of it. We can say, look, we fit into this, square peg, square hole. The judge doesn't need to look any further. You can make a decision based on these things, and it saves, it can save time and money and all this kind of stuff. A lot of money. But that's how you end a lawsuit before. It's one way how you can end a lawsuit prior to it actually going to trial. And the reason, typically, in my opinion, that insurance companies, which will be involved here, and big entities want to see, can the
the injured party survived this summary judgment fight is because it usually, the big expense of defending this lawsuit comes after the fact, after the summary judgment motion. And so it just, for them, that's how they work their actuary tables and make a decision. Okay, do we write this settlement check or not?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll also be interested to see how insurance works with ERCOT, since it's this private company, but it's
yes, absolutely
overseen by public entities. Again, that whole quasi-public-private thing kind of weirds me out a little bit.
Which, again, the insurance companies that are involved, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out because of that, especially in the context of sovereign immunity.
Exactly.
Because insurance companies obviously going to lean on that if they can.
So let's talk about sovereign immunity. Okay. So why is sovereign immunity important?
Well, because if it's present, then the entity being sued, they're immune from suit. They don't. You
can't sue them.
You can't sue them. Yeah.
So in this lawsuit, both ERCOT and Entergy Texas were sued. Entergy Texas, it's a private company. They can be sued. There's no question of sovereign immunity there. So, but the question arises, can ERCOT be sued because is it entitled to sovereign immunity? And basically, without giving a 500-year history of American and English law, sovereign immunity basically is the government saying, you can't sue me unless I say you can, which is really confusing, right?
Big time. And it sounds terrible on paper.
It sounds terrible on paper. This has come up a lot for me in the aviation litigation setting. Right. So this arises basically from English common law. People couldn't sue the crown, right? Or the government, the British government. And so that was kind of a problem because, hey, when you do bad stuff, like, I don't know, chop your wives' heads off, Henry VIII, I think? Henry VIII, yeah. Elizabeth the First dad. Kicking it back, history, love history. Moving on. So you have to be able to hold your leaders accountable, and you have to be able to hold the state accountable. So this idea that you can't sue the king unless the king says it's okay has now translated into basically American law as sovereign immunity, so that the federal and state government said, hey, you can't sue us but for certain things, right? And in Texas, it's called the Texas Tort Claims Act. And there are certain actions listed, right? So if basically the state government, and we're just going to talk about state government here, does one of these actions, or an agent or representative of the state government does one of these actions in the course and scope of its being an agent of the state, then the state of Texas has said, okay, now you can sue me.
Right.
And it's the Texas Tort Claims Act. There's a lot of case law around it. There's a lot of scholarly articles. It can be pretty complex. But basically, it's Texas saying, if you fit one of these items in this checklist, then you can sue me. Otherwise, sorry, bro, you can't sue me.
Right.
So, what's an example of sovereign immunity?
Well,
airports.
Airports is one, and you actually have a lot more expertise in that because you're past. I'm gonna again defer to you on this still.
Sure. So airports. Okay. So for example, DFW is considered like a public area, right? Dallas-Fort Worth International. So if you go into DFW, you buy your ticket, you're going to fly on American, and there's a giant hole, and you didn't. Well, let's not put it that way. You're in DFW, and then an agent for DFW is negligent, and they drop a ceiling tile on your head.
Yep.
Because they're in their course and scope of duty of doing whatever, right?
Maintenance in the airport.
And you're seriously injured. Okay, well, now you have an argument. Now it's not guaranteed, but you have an argument saying that, hey, I am in this airport, which is considered public, and I was hurt, and I want to sue the airport for hurting me.
Yeah.
Because they shouldn't have done that. And so this is a very highly oversimplified example, because I actually had a similar case to this, and there are a lot of arguments I, representing the insurance company, was able to make to say, oh no, like, you can't actually sue. Sovereign immunity does exist. But that's just an example of, okay. Or other example.
So in that situation, did sovereign immunity prevent DFW from, were they allowed to sue DFW for that type of situation or not?
I'm trying to remember, actually. I think in that situation, it didn't get decided on. I think it settled before.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's just an example. That's an example. Is this is not a black and white thing.
Mm-hmm.
This is, I mean, much like most of what, or much like a lot of what we do, there's arguments on both sides of whether or not sovereign immunity applies or doesn't apply. And there's just a lot of ways you can go with that.
I think probably an easier example is that, there was one case that I looked at a while ago. This woman, she was going to a junior league event. It was out in Dallas, Fort Worth. It was one of the convention centers. So she's walking, and then there was a problem with the sidewalk, and she tripped and fell. The sidewalk is owned by the city. And so she sued the city for improperly maintaining the sidewalk, and because of that, causing her like jacked up knee or ankle or something.
Sure.
And she won because the city had a duty to maintain the sidewalk. They failed to maintain the sidewalk, and that fell within that checklist of actions that's in the Texas Tort Claims Act. So they messed up, and they're like, this is one of the few things that you can actually sue us for.
Yeah.
So all of that to say, hopefully that kind of demystifies sovereign immunity a little bit. And does it?
Yeah.
You think
absolutely.
so? Okay.
For sure.
Okay.
For sure.
I'm just checking here because sovereign immunity is complex, man. There's a lot of stuff in it.
Yeah, definitely.
So, but all of that to say, it brings it around to ERCOT isn't the city of Fort Worth or Dallas maintaining sidewalks. ERCOT isn't DFW.
Right.
It's a private entity, but it's overseen by the Texas legislature and the PUC.
Yeah.
So does that somehow cloak ERCOT in the status of being part of like the state, even though it's not?
Yeah.
Well, I think that's interesting.
Well, and just to make it clear, like it's kind of a rhetorical question for our listeners because we don't know.
Yeah,
because it is a very strange entity. Yeah,
it's very strange. There's not a lot of case law to deal with this. But I did notice when I was doing a little digging last night that here in Dallas, actually, in around 2016, there was a lawsuit against ERCOT by someone called Panda Power.
Okay.
I love the name. I don't know what they do, but I love the name because pandas are cool. Anyway, so Panda Power, and forgive me because I'm looking at my notes here, but basically they sued ERCOT regarding allegations of flawed energy predictions in 2016. And at that point, the lawyers representing ERCOT turned around and said, no, you can't sue us because of sovereign immunity. We're basically cloaked in the authority of the government. So we're safe, and this also doesn't fall within the Texas Tort Claims Act. You can't sue us. And Panda Power's like, yeah, we can. You're not the government. So it went up on appeal.
Yep.
And actually, the Court of Appeals right here in Dallas ruled in 2018 that actually,
that they were entitled to sovereign immunity.
They were entitled to sovereign immunity.
That is interesting to me. And obviously the facts of that case could be different than what we're dealing with here.
Oh, I'm sure they're very different.
Yeah.
When they say like flawed energy predictions, it makes me think finance stuff.
Well, yeah, it goes back to the capitalistic idea we talked about because their job is to auctioneer and all that. All that. It's different than winterizing, not winterizing pipes or the grid, and then also giving false statements about how long this is probably going to happen and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I agree. Very different. So, and that's why this could turn out totally different than the 2018 case
absolutely.
did.
And that's only one case, and that was here in Dallas, right? I mean, where's this case filed? Like, I'm guessing Harris County or the county that Conroe is in?
Probably, which I think is Montgomery County.
Yeah, Montgomery County.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it could be different, right? Because, Texas courts, the different Court of Appeals, like so the Court of Appeals in Dallas doesn't have to listen to what the Court of Appeals in
Houston. Yeah, 1st or 14th district down there.
I was about to say, I was like, how can I say that without it being confusing? So there are two Court of Appeals, y'all, in Houston, the 1st and the 14th, because it's a really big county.
Right. We've got 14 courts of appeals in different parts of the state. That
Two of them are in Houston.
Right. And on the civil side, they all feed up to the Texas Supreme Court. But yeah, you're right. We can have different decisions coming out of different courts in different parts of the state.
But all the courts have to listen to the Texas Supreme Court.
Right.
So there's that.
Yeah. Well, it'll be, it'll be interesting to see how this turns out. The biggest thing I think I take away from this is not even a legal thing, is that, okay, hopefully ERCOT, our providers, everybody learns from what happened, and not just to this little boy, but statewide.
Yeah.
What happened, and let's fix this problem coming forward so that, okay, yes, this happens once in every couple hundred years or whatever. Well, we've got the technology now. Let's fix the problem.
Let's fix it. We have technology. We're the energy capital of the country. Yeah. I mean, who would have ever thought this would happen to us?
Right.
And it should never happen again. Kids shouldn't have to die in their beds because they allegedly died of hypothermia because the power went out.
Yeah.
I mean, just y'all.
Yeah.
Let's make sure we're at least trying to help the kids, if nothing else. So we'll see. We'll see how this case develops.
Yeah. Well, and like we said, real sad story.
Yeah.
Everybody else that suffered inconveniences, you kind of have to keep everything in perspective.
Absolutely. Well, yeah.
On the somber episode today,
it is a somber episode. It is. It's a really sad episode, but we'll see. We'll see how this case develops, and we'll see if this is a case that turns into something that helps keep ERCOT responsible.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, well, we'll see you all next time.
Guys, thanks for listening. Closing arguments are coming up, but make sure before you go rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast anywhere that you listen to your podcast. Check us out on YouTube, and you can check us out on Instagram and talk to us. Tell us what you want to hear about. You can search us at #lawyered, spelled out. You can talk to Andrea at andrea.s.turner, and you can talk to me at the Dallas Lawyer. See y'all again soon.
Welcome back to Closing Arguments, y'all. The Queen of Pop has resurfaced. Yes, FX recently released an episode as part of the New York Times Presents series called Framing Britney Spears, and it is all about her 13-year guardianship. So, what's the deal? The directors clearly think that the #Free Britney movement should be granted, and Britney should be sprung from her guardianship. Is she going to be sprung? Frankly, probably not, because she has a very long uphill battle to prove that she should no longer be under guardianship. Stay tuned and let's see what happens with her guardianship proceedings.